Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
And you're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
Hello, classic rock fans, and Happy New Year. Hope you had a great holiday season. This is my annual book review and preview video in which I talk about the books I read in 2024 and plan out the books I'm going to read in 2025. The whole point of this video is basically to give some recommendations on some books that I enjoyed and perhaps to hear back from you in the comments about some of the books that I have read or some of the books that I'm planning on reading. If you've read or heard anything about any of the books I'm going to talk about in this video, please post a comment and let me know what you think. I'm a big reader. I like making this video every year, so would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts to share. So I'm going to dive right in, and we're going to get started with the books I read in 2024 for interviews. These are the books in which I interviewed the authors at some point during this year. So if you want to see those interviews, please check them out on this YouTube channel. Okay, first up, You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio, My Wild Rock and Roll Life by Anita Gevinson. So one of the interviews I did this year was with Chad Cushions, who wrote Nothing's Bad Luck, which was all about Warren Zevon. Great interview, lots of fun. After we spoke, Chad emailed me and said that I should really get in touch with Anita because Anita dated Warren Zevon in the 80s, and he told me that if I want to talk about Warren Zevon on the channel, which I do, I should talk to Anita because she would have some great stories about him. So I looked her up and I found out she had a book of her own. So I thought, hey, this is great. If she comes on the show, I can mention her book as well. So I got a copy of the book, read through it. Yes, lots of great Warren Zevon stories, very interesting, of course, in that regard, but also that she was in rock radio in the 80s and 90s, and her story is fascinating. So I really enjoyed hearing about her career and her life, which intersected with a number of rock stars, even romantically, beyond Warren Zevon. So in our interview, we pretty much stuck to Zevon topics because that's actually primarily why she wanted to come on the show, was to talk about Warren. But afterwards, we did talk about having her back on the show for like a part 2 interview to talk more about her career in rock radio. I'm not sure if we're going to get to that in 2025. I hope to. So if you would like to see more from Anita on this channel, please post a comment and let me know, and I'll be sure to get her back on sooner than later. DLR Book by Darren Paltrowitz. I have been aware of Darren's podcast, The Paltrowcast, for a couple of years now. He has interviewed a number of big-name rock stars that I have watched. So when I found out that his first music book was coming out this year, I reached out and asked if I could have a review copy so I could prep for an interview with him. And he was nice enough to send me a digital copy of this book. So I read through the digital copy, and I was so impressed that I thought, you know what, actually I want a proper copy of this book, a nice physical one for the bookshelf. So I got a hold of this after we spoke. This is a fantastic book. Darren did an excellent job. As he says in the interview, this isn't the book for someone who's never heard of David Lee Roth. This is the book for a Diamond Dave fan and someone who wants to know if all the myths about this guy are true. And it's a deep dive into his solo career. There's so many Van Halen books out there already, but there hasn't been one about specifically Diamond Dave since Diamond Dave's autobiography, back in the 90s. And that whole thing is a bizarre rambling mess. So I don't even count that one. Darren did an excellent job cataloging Dave's career, and having him on the podcast earlier this year was a treat. He was a lot of fun to talk to. So if you like Diamond David Lee Roth, definitely get this book and definitely check out the podcast that Darren does. I do hope to have him back on the show in the future because talking music with him was a lot of fun. He's definitely a guy who knows a lot about rock and roll. So, thumbs up on this one for sure. Behind the Screams, The Dream Masters Revealed by Mick Strawn. So, I'm wearing my Rockin' Pod 2023 t-shirt. I met and first interviewed Mick at Rockin' Pod in Nashville in 2023. I got this copy of the book from him while we were there. And he was so funny in that interview that we had at Rockin' Pod that I thought to myself, I absolutely need to have him back on the show at some point to talk about his book, if only to hang out and get some laughs out of him again, because the guy is hilarious. If you're not familiar with Mick, he's a production designer, and he's worked on a lot of movies, including Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and A Nightmare on Elm Street 4. And this book is all about the production of A Nightmare on Elm Street 4. And it features interviews with just about everybody involved with the movie. So Mick came on the podcast, told some great stories about working on this movie, about working on some other movies, about working on music videos that were tie-ins to the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. It was hysterical, as I expected. And Mick is a great guy. I'm going back to Rockin' Pod in 2025. I don't know if he'll be there. I hope he will be. And if he is, I will definitely make sure to talk with him again because, like I said, great guy, very funny. And honestly, if you're an 80s horror fan, there's a lot of interesting stuff that we talked about because this is from the era of practical effects. And Mick is a guy who has done all kinds of great, innovative work with practical movie effects. And I just think that stuff's cool, and it was great to have him on the show. All the Leaves Are Brown, How the Mamas and the Papas Came Together and Broke Apart by Scott Shea. Scott's brother Mark hosts the Performance Anxiety podcast here on the Pantheon Network, and Mark tipped me off about this book. I was interested as soon as I heard about it because the Mamas and the Papas were absolutely a band I wanted to learn more about, and this is like a serious, heavy-duty rock and roll biography right here. A lot of research went into this. And I read it and had Scott on. I thought the interview went really well. Scott's a great guy. And this is a really impressive book. I really enjoyed this one. Scott told me that the book he's working on next is going to be about Waylon Jennings, which, my goodness, another great topic. So as soon as that book is out, you can rest assured I'm going to have him back on the show to talk about that. So if you want to learn more about, 60s hippie rock or the Mamas and the Papas, highly recommended. Scott did an excellent job with this one. Traveling Man, On the Road and Behind the Scenes with Bob Seger by Tom Weschler and Gary Graff. So this book was actually published back in 2010, but it's new to me. I was in Detroit earlier this year, and during my visit, I made a point to get over to the Detroit Historical Museum because I had heard they were having an exhibit based on Tom Weschler's photographs of Bob Seger. And I wanted to see a Bob Seger thing while I was in Detroit. Well, the exhibit was awesome, and on my way out in the gift shop, I saw that Tom's book was for sale, so I got a copy. And the 2-part Bob Seger retrospective I just did was inspired by this book. And as I was planning that, as luck would have it, I saw that Tom's co-writer here, Gary Graff, was hitting the podcast sphere to promote his newest book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. So I thought, hey, this would be great. I'll invite Gary on the show to talk about his new book, and then while he's here, we can also talk about this one. He came on the show. He was happy to talk about this book as well, and I used clips of that in my Bob Seger episode, which was absolutely fantastic. I also reached out to Tom Weschler to see if he would be interested in coming on the podcast, and he directed me to his manager, and I had a little back and forth with the manager. It seemed like things were going in the right direction, but then it just kind of trailed off, and I just didn't really get any confirmation from the guy. So unfortunately, having Tom on kind of fell apart. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get Tom on the show at some point, but I do know that Gary Graff should be coming back to the show in 2025 because he has a new book, The 501 Essential Albums of the 80s, coming out in a couple of months. And I absolutely need to interview him about that book because I will have much more thoughts about 80s albums than 90s albums. So stay tuned for another interview with Gary Graff in 2025. Oh, and I just remembered, I read one other book for research purposes. I read the digital copy of Dave Penzer's book, Sitting Ringside, Volume 1. When I had Dave on the show to talk about his days in WCW, we were joined by Aaron Camaro from the Decibel Geek podcast. That was a great podcast. Dave Penzer is going to be coming back on the show very soon. So before talking to him, I also read his book. If you're a wrestling fan, gets a thumbs up from me. I enjoyed that. So looking forward to talking to Dave again about his new book, which is called Sitting Ringside Volume 2. So these were the books I read for interviews that I did this year. Now let's talk about the books I read for research purposes. Now, if you remember, just this past summer, I posted a podcast/video essay about Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA album. And to do research for that project, I decided to start with the book that inspired Bruce to write the song Born in the USA in the first place, and that was Born on the 4th of July by Ron Kovic. And when I got a copy of this book, I found out that Ron Kovic published another book, which is a follow-up to this one just this year, which is called A Dangerous Country. I thought the timing of that was telling me something, so I got a copy of this as well, and I read both. Now, I'm happy that I've read both of these books, but I will tell you that they are extremely emotionally challenging. These are brutal first-hand accounts of the Vietnam War. And if you don't know Ron's story, basically, he volunteered for service. He went to fight in the Vietnam War, and while he was there, he suffered a horrible, life-altering wound that left him paralyzed from the chest down. There was a film that was made about him starring Tom Cruise back in the late 80s called Born on the 4th of July. It's directed by Oliver Stone. And then the other part of the book is his survival story of going through the physical therapy and, trying to basically get back to normal life, which he was never really able to do because he was paralyzed. And not just paralyzed, but mentally scarred from all this trauma. So, yeah, this is a really intense book, and A Dangerous Country is a follow-up to that. It talks about how he adjusts to a regular life in the late 70s and 80s, how he started to acclimate a little bit better once he published this book, and this book was received very well at the time. And A Dangerous Country also includes his actual diary that he kept while he was a soldier in Vietnam. So again, both of these are actually great first-hand accounts of the Vietnam War. So, do I recommend them? Absolutely yes. But I will tell you, you need to be prepared because there are some horrifying, traumatic things in these books. These are very heavy reads. You hear the phrase, war is hell. I don't know that means a whole lot except to people who have been there, or at the very least to someone who has read an account of someone who's been there. The phrase war is hell will mean a lot more to you once you read these books. Now, because I was working on that project about Born in the USA, I absolutely wanted to interview Ron Kovic. Unfortunately, I was not able to make that happen. I was talking to the people over at his publisher, Akashic Books. They were very nice, and they were very gracious to me, and I know they made an effort to get Ron to come on the show with me. Unfortunately, we just weren't able to make it happen. And, so I do want to say thank you to the people over at Akashic for at least making an effort. I would love to talk to Ron at any point, but I know that interviews are tough on him because this material is so traumatic, it's difficult for him to talk about, and also because this book came out this year, he was in high demand. So unfortunately, we weren't able to make it happen on this channel, but if you can find other interviews he's done recently, yeah, I would recommend checking them out, but absolutely get these books. And then another book I read for that Born in the USA podcast I did was There Was Nothing You Could Do, Born in the USA and the End of the Heartland by Stephen Hayden. This is my favorite book of 2024. And it comes from one of my favorite music writers. Stephen Hayden is awesome. I don't want to lay it on too thick, but this guy wrote one of the best books about classic rock I've read in recent years called Twilight of the Gods a couple of years ago. And he was recently involved in the Yacht Rock documentary that's on Max right now. I can't recommend that documentary enough. When I found out Stephen Hayden was writing a Born in the USA related book this year, I pre-ordered it immediately, and it did not disappoint. In fact, it exceeded expectations, which were very high. So, yeah, I love this book. I think he did a great job. It's not really a nuts and bolts, how the album got made kind of book. It's more of a, what is this album all about, and what is Bruce Springsteen all about sort of book. It's very engaging. It's very celebratory. And I absolutely want to have Stephen Hayden on the show. Actually, he said he would come on the podcast, at least on Twitter. He messaged me back, which was really nice. He said he liked my interview with Howard Soons because I got Howard Soons to talk shit about another Bob Dylan biographer, Clinton Halen. So I guess he saw that clip and got a kick out of it. That actually means a lot to me that Stephen Hayden has seen some of my work, because I think that guy, more than almost anybody else, is doing so much great stuff for classic rock fans. You know, if it's not books like these, it's documentaries like the Yacht Rock documentary, or one of the podcasts he's a part of. He's a regular on a Bob Dylan podcast. He used to do another podcast called Rivals with Jordan Runtagh, who's been on this show. That was a fantastic podcast. So basically, whatever Stephen is involved with, I'm interested, you know. So I'm going to try again to get him to come on the show this year to talk about specifically this project, because I think it's just a really good book. You know, if you like Bruce Springsteen, yeah, absolutely get yourself a copy of this one. And that's it as far as books I read for research. The rest are just books I wanted to read this year. Crazy Like Me, From Memphis and the Rock and Roll Trio to Fleetwood Mac by Billy Burnett. I originally got this book because I thought it would be interesting to interview Billy Burnett about Christy McVie when Christy McVie passed away now 2 years ago, because I wanted to do a podcast that celebrated Christy's life and career. Unfortunately, I was not able to put that together, but I did eventually read this book. Unfortunately, I have to say I can't really give it a thumbs up as it is, because it is in desperate need of an editor or perhaps a consultant, someone who could have sat down with Billy and told him, man, you have some great stories here, but you got to tell the people what happened. Let me explain. This guy has had an incredible life and career. Fascinating guy right here. And he has all of these stories that as he starts to tell them, you think, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. And then the story ends the sentence after that. It is such a tease. Every other page, it seems that an amazing story is about to begin. And then he just wraps it up a sentence later. And you're just left with this lingering feeling of like, well, what happened? You know, like, dive into it a little bit more. And I don't know if it's because, you know, these are a lot of R-rated stories and he's talking about famous people in the music industry or in show business, and he's got to be careful with that kind of stuff. And if that's the case, I suppose I understand, but it is brutal. The reader really is left in the lurch at a lot of points. I can't say this is the best book I've ever read, but I can say that Billy Burnett is a really interesting guy, and reading the book makes me want to learn more about him. You know, so I don't know if he'll ever write another one or write a revision to this or something in the future. But if you're not familiar with who this guy is, you know, look him up and you'll be surprised at how you actually might be familiar with him after all, given some of the projects he's been a part of. So here's one I had been putting off for a couple of years at this point. AC/DC, The Kerrang! Files by Malcolm Dome. So, Malcolm Dome is one of the great music journalists of the classic rock era. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, and when I had heard he had passed, I found out that he wrote this book about one of my favorite bands, AC/DC, and I thought I will absolutely get a copy of that. I misunderstood it at first. Reading this cover, I thought this book was basically going to be a collection of all of the articles that Kerrang! Published about AC/DC during their run. Well, I was wrong. That's not what this is. This is just a straight-up AC/DC biography by Malcolm, which is fantastic because Malcolm was very close with the band during their heyday, even in the Bon Scott years. So, to me, this is like a really good entry point for someone who wants to learn about AC/DC. If you have not read anything about AC/DC, this might be the first book you want to get because it gives you an overview of their whole history. And then if you want to learn more, well, then you can check out some other AC/DC books, like perhaps the ones written by Jesse Fink, who I've had on this show before. Now, Jesse Fink, of course, published the book Bon the Last Highway, which is all about Bon Scott's last years. And in that book, he got a lot of criticism because he suggested that Bon might have died from a heroin overdose instead of the official story of Bon drinking himself to death. Well, Malcolm actually mentions the heroin overdose rumors in this book. So that was really interesting to me because that says, to me at least, that Jesse's not pulling things out of thin air. So there's been a couple of people who've suggested that heroin was the actual explanation for his untimely passing. But anyway, all that to be said, I'm really glad I read this book. It's a shame that Malcolm is not with us anymore. He was an excellent writer, an excellent music journalist. So I would definitely recommend getting a copy of this book if you want to read some of his writing. And I will say, if you want to hear a little bit about him, I did talk to his friend and old colleague Xavier Russell on the podcast last year. And we talked about Xavier's time at Kerrang! And of course, I asked him about his old buddy Malcolm. So he shared some memories of that guy as well. So definitely check out my interview with Xavier Russell and get yourself a copy of Malcolm's book about AC/DC. Escape from New York, the official story of the film by John Walsh. No, not that John Walsh. This is a really nice movie book that includes beautiful photos and artwork and posters and screenshots, along with write-ups about the making of the film Escape from New York. Now, Escape from New York is my favorite movie of all time. So when I saw there was this beautiful collection of stories and photos and prints and everything else, I just had to get a copy of this. So I did. I read it. I think it's really well done. And John was nice enough to send me a signed book plate. I'm definitely hoping to have John on the podcast sometime this year. Not sure when that will be. He's got a number of movie books that are just beautiful presentations of the making of these films. I have another one of his books laying around, and he just put out a new one about Gladiator 2, which I saw recently and thought was great. So maybe I'll get a copy of that one as well. So keep an eye out for a movie-centric podcast that I might do later this year with John Walsh. And check out some of his other work. He did a book about Flash Gordon, about Conan the Barbarian, Ray Harryhausen. Very cool topics. So yeah, big thumbs up on this one. And finally, Jaws. Specifically, Jaws by Peter Benchley, and Jaws 2 and Jaws the Revenge by Hank Searles. Last year, I read all of the Rambo books by David Morrell, and I thought it would be fun to read another movie tie-in trilogy of books so I picked the Jaws series. There was no novelization for Jaws 3D, so I just read these three, and I will tell you, not as rewarding as reading the Rambo books, but I did still enjoy them to a degree. Here's my big hot take of this series. Jaws by Peter Benchley is the worst one. And here's an even hotter take. Jaws by Peter Benchley is not a good book. Or at least it's not one that lives up to the hype. A lot of people forget that Jaws was a huge bestseller before the movie was ever made. It's why the movie was made. It was because this book sold so well. So I thought this would be a really good read. And I don't know, it just didn't work for me. I thought the writing was clunky, and I thought some of the best dialogue and scenes from the film would be here, but not really the case. I think the screenplay ends up being a lot better. Also, the stuff that's in the book that's not in the movie, not particularly interesting. So it was kind of shocking to me because Jaws the film is one of my favorite movies ever, and there's just such a wide breadth of quality, or at least enjoyability, between the film and the book it was based on that it really surprised me. Now, Jaws was a letdown, but you know what? These two? Surprisingly good! The inverse of the movies. Jaws the Revenge, famously one of the worst movies ever made, and Jaws 2, maybe not the worst movie ever made, but not a good movie. Surprisingly good novelizations. These were based on the screenplays of the film, so there is more to the story in both of these books, and in both cases, the additional material in the book, I think, makes them better stories than what was eventually on screen for the corresponding films. In Jaws 2, there's a lot of organized crime that's going on as a B-plot, and in Jaws the Revenge, there's some drug smuggling going on. Michael Caine's character in the film is actually a drug smuggler in Jaws the Revenge, and also some voodoo stuff with some of the locals on the islands that they're at. I don't know, just more interesting, more engaging, a little more horror than what you see in the films. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you got to run out and get these books because they're like really great. But I will tell you that I enjoyed reading both of these books significantly more than I did reading Peter Benchley's original. So I don't know what you're going to do with that information about these books. I can tell you I'm not going to be rushing out to get The Deep, which is the only other thing I know by Peter Benchley. But you know what? I might check out to see if Hank Searles wrote any other movie tie-in books, because that was surprisingly good. He caught me off guard by how decent these two were. And at the very least, by reading this little trilogy of books, I had a nice, pleasant surprise from Jaws 2 and Jaws the Revenge. And that is it for the books I read in 2024. Have you read any of these? If so, please tell me what you thought in the comments. Otherwise, now we will be moving on to the books I plan on reading in 2025. I'm going to first start with some books that I am currently reading right now. The first, Covenant of the Flame by David Morrell. I interviewed David earlier this year about a number of books he's written, the Rambo books, another one called Last Reveille. I was reading The Covenant of the Flame up until he had came on the show, but at that point I had only read about a third of the way through, so I didn't really have any questions about the book for him. I didn't finish the book because right after we did that interview, I had to move on to a different book for a different interview. The challenges of being a content creator, I guess. But anyway, I took a break from this book. I was enjoying it, so I'm going to pick it up again sooner than later and try and finish it out. David Morrell might be coming back on the podcast in 2025. He told me that there is a book called The Rambo Report coming out in April of this year, and he suggested that he might be open to coming back with the guy who was writing that book. So I've got that pre-ordered. That is definitely a book I plan to read this year, and if I can get David and that author to come on the show to talk about that project, that would be a dream. Another book I am currently reading, Jimmy Buffett, A Good Life All the Way by Ryan White. Ryan White was a guest on this show earlier this year. He was a special guest for my Born in the USA video essay that I did earlier. But anyway, we also talked about this book briefly, and as Chris and I are going to be starting up our Jimmy Buffett mini-series, our songwriter series in a couple of weeks here. This is the book I'm going to rely on for research purposes, for the biographical aspects of Jimmy's life. And once we get to the end of that mini-series about Jimmy, Ryan is going to come back on the podcast to talk about the book and to talk about Jimmy Buffett. Ryan's a great guy. It was awesome talking to him this year, so I'm really looking forward to having him back on the show. And just saw Chris over this weekend, and we are going to get started on that Jimmy Buffett series sooner than later. And since we are doing that project, 2 other books I'm going to attempt to read over the course of the year while we're doing it. Tales from Margaritaville and A Pirate Looks at 50, both by Jimmy Buffett himself. This one I started reading a number of years ago and only got about halfway through and kind of lost interest because it's not your typical autobiography. So I'm going to give it another chance, and hopefully there's some stuff in here I can draw out for the podcast's sake. And this Tales from Margaritaville, I think this is like a collection of short stories, of fictional stories. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with this book, but I'm looking forward to it. If it's creative writing from Jimmy, that's awesome. But whatever the case, I'm going to try and read both of these for the Jimmy Buffett podcast mini-series we're doing, and I will talk about them in that series. So if you're a fan of Jimmy Buffett, stay tuned. We're going to be talking about him a lot on this channel in 2025. Okay, and now here are some books I am reading, hopefully for interview purposes. First up, Beast by Chad Cushions. Chad was a guest on the pod earlier this year when we talked about his book, Nothing's Bad Luck, which was all about Warren Zevon. While we were doing that interview, we mentioned his other book, Beast, which is all about Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham, and Chad talked a little bit about writing that book. Well, I had such a great time talking to Chad in that interview that I really want to do it again. I want to have him back on the show. So I told him I would love to interview him just about Beast. So he was nice enough to send me a copy, which was amazing. And I am going to read this sooner than later and hopefully have him back on the show to talk about John Bonham. Chad is a fantastic writer. Nothing's Bad Luck is one of my favorite rock and roll biographies. I have high expectations for this one. And also, one of the coolest guys we've had on the podcast since we've been doing it. So, looking forward to having Chad back on the show soon. We got to get out of this place, the soundtrack of the Vietnam War. I found this in a shop of vendors in Minocqua, Wisconsin, while I was on vacation earlier this year. Just the title alone was enough to get me interested enough to buy the book. The music inspired by the Vietnam War is a fascinating topic for me. So I am hoping to do some sort of video essay that explores it a little bit. I don't know what that will look like yet. That's going to take me some time to figure out because I want to do it right if I'm going to do it at all. Doug Bradley and Craig Werner, I'm not familiar with these guys. I don't believe they're on social media, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to interview them, but I am definitely going to try because this book sounds very interesting, and like I said, I'm hoping I can make something out of it. Something based on it, I should say. I don't want to steal their idea. I don't just want to take what they've done here. I basically just want to read the book and then kind of gather my thoughts about music inspired by the Vietnam War. Eagle and Mirror by Jesse Fink. Jesse Fink has been a guest on this podcast twice, actually. He was here to talk about his book, Bon the Last Highway, which is all about the final years of Bon Scott's life. And he was also here with Louis Navia to talk about their book, Pure Narco, which is all about Louis's real life as a drug smuggler. Both books are fantastic. Jesse is absolutely one of my favorite writers. And when he told me his next book was going to be a real-life spy story, yeah, I was interested. So I got this book for Christmas. I'm very excited to read it. My dad got this for me for Christmas, and when he gave it to me, he was just like, I want to read that when you're done. So yeah, looking forward to this. Hopefully we can get Jesse back on the podcast, maybe to talk about it, and maybe to also talk about his last AC/DC book, which is called Bond Notes from the Highway, which is a follow-up to Bond the Last Highway. I'll need some time to get through both of them, but once I do, I will get in touch with Jesse and see if he can come back on the show to talk about this stuff, because like I said, he's one of my favorite writers, and I really enjoyed the other times he was on the show, so I'd love to have him back on. So these are the books I'm going to be relying on for interviews and projects in 2025, but now I will talk about the books that I am just going to be reading for the enjoyment of. And we'll start with this one, Apostles of Mercy. So if you've watched any of these book videos I've done in the past, you'll recognize this name, Lindsay Ellis. Lindsay Ellis is a video essayist who got started on YouTube years ago, and as far as I'm concerned, she is the best who's ever done it. If you like video essays on YouTube at all, you should definitely check out her channel. Her video essays are really better described as documentaries. Absolutely fantastic work. She's now on a platform called Nebula, so if you want to see what she's up to now, you have to go check out that service. Well, anyway, she's also an author. She started with a book called Axiom's End back in 2020, and the sequel to that was called Truth of the Divine. This is the third in the series, called Apostles of Mercy. I enjoyed the other two books in the series, so I want to keep up with it and read this third part. I believe there are two more that are supposed to follow this. And what was cool this year was that she went out on a book tour to promote Apostles of Mercy, and one of the stops was fairly close to me. It was in Naperville, Illinois. I'm in Wisconsin, so it wasn't that far of a drive for me. So I went to the event, arrived at the venue literally just in time because, of course, delays because of Chicagoland traffic. But anyway, got to the venue. She did a Q&A with the audience and a talk, and it was a lot of fun. And then afterwards, she signed books and took photos with people, which was really cool. It was really nice just to talk with her for a minute while we were doing the photo. So it was very cool to have an opportunity to come out in person and support what she's working on now. So it was a lot of fun. Got an autograph and everything. And then, as luck would have it, this author event with Lindsay Ellis I went to was actually hosted by another video content creator I'm a fan of. He's a guy named Brad Jones, and he published a book a couple of years ago called Class of 86. When the event was over, I went over and said hello to him, got a photo, and asked him about this book that he had published a couple of years ago. He had a couple of copies with him, but by the time I got to him, he had sold all of the ones he brought with, so he didn't have one that I could buy. But he told me a little bit about the book. It sounded really interesting. It sounded like a lot of fun. It's like a post-apocalypse story. That's kind of up my alley, so I thought, you know what, I'll just buy a copy, check this out, and it sounds like a lot of fun. So I don't know if I'm going to have him on the podcast to talk about it, but if I can think of a fun angle that ties into music somehow, we'll see what happens. Okay, back to music. Kristofferson, The Wild American by Stephen Miller. So Kris Kristofferson passed away just a couple of months ago. I posted a video on this channel that was basically a tribute to him, because Kris Kristofferson is a freaking badass. He was a real deal. Great artist, great songwriter, great human being. And everything I've learned since he's passed has made me just want to learn even more. So I asked for this book for Christmas. I got this for Christmas, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I don't know if I'm going to do a podcast thing about Kristofferson. I said how I felt about him in that video. But I definitely will be listening to more of his music this year, and I think this book is going to help guide me through his significant catalog. Kicking and Dreaming, a story of heart, soul, and rock and roll by Anne and Nancy Wilson, and also Charles R. Cross. Couple of things. I have tickets to see Heart later this year, so I'm going to be listening to a lot of their music in the lead up to that. Actually, I've had tickets to that show for a couple of years now because it had been postponed a couple of times because Anne was dealing with some pretty serious health issues, but from what I understand, she is clear of all that now, and they are going to be returning to the stage this year. So their music will absolutely be on my mind and in my rotation this year. But the real reason I want to read this book is their co-author here, Charles R. Cross. This guy passed away, sadly, this year. And he was a pretty well-respected music writer. And I haven't read any of his books before. But when I heard that he had passed, I took a look at my bookshelf and saw that I actually did have one of his books. So to honor this guy, I'm going to introduce myself to his writing with this one, Kicking and Dreaming. Job Man, My Life in Professional Wrestling by Chris Malterer and Larry Wyden. Okay, so this is kind of a weird one. I got this book from my uncle, and he had this book because my uncle is friends with a guy named Jake the Milkman Milliman. And Jake was a professional jobber in the wrestling industry back in the 80s and 90s. And if you didn't know, a jobber is basically a pro wrestler who gets put in a match specifically to lose. Back in the day, when the WWF or a major pro wrestling entity would come to a town, they would hire local talent to wrestle their stars, and the local guy would typically lose. Jake Milliman was one of those guys. You know, he's wrestled some pretty famous wrestlers, and he would always lose. But because he was wrestling, my uncle and their friends would all go to Jake's matches and cheer him on, even though they knew he was going to lose. So my uncle got this book. He recognized a couple of names in here. I believe this guy was based out of the Wisconsin area. So my uncle knows I'm into wrestling now, and he enjoyed this book, so he recommended it to me. It honestly sounded really interesting, so I'm going to check this out because I think it'll be an interesting look at the pro wrestling industry of the 70s and 80s, and I think that'll be a fun topic to explore. But am I going to do anything on the podcast about it? I don't know. I mean, we do talk about wrestling from time to time, but not sure. We'll see. All right, so in 2023, I revisited First Blood, which I originally read back in high school. Last year, I reread Jaws, which I originally read, I believe, also back in high school. So this year I'm going to do something similar, but it's not going to be a book that was adapted into a movie, and it's not going to be a trilogy of books. It's just going to be one, although a longer one. This is a weird one. It's called Footfall by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. This is an alien invasion story. I originally read this when I was like 13 or 14 years old. I remember I liked it back then, but I don't remember really anything else about it. But a couple of months ago, it popped in my head, and I just thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to get a copy of it and reread it and see if there's anything actually interesting there. The cover is promising. You can see here on the back it says, "The snouts are coming." So I guess the aliens are referred to as snouts. Also, I made a point to get this specific paperback edition of the book because it has this cover that opens up that shows you a picture of the aliens that are invading, and that is hilarious. Looks like an elephant. So I guess those are the snouts. This is the same paperback edition that I read when I was a kid, so I wanted to get this same one. It was only a couple of bucks on eBay, so I got it now, and I'm glad I did because also in this front cover, the previous owner wrote a review of the book. And here, I'll read it for you real quick. B+, A-. Good, interesting, well-told sci-fi. Not too plausible, but a lot of good thinking. So, yeah, okay, I guess I got a lot of good thinking to look forward to with this one. It is pretty long, so I'm not going to be reading this right away. But, yeah, here's a little sci-fi oddity that I remember I kind of liked as a kid. I want to see if it holds up. So yeah, Footfall. If you've heard of this one, please let me know, because I have never heard of anyone reference this anywhere online ever. I just remember it from when I was a kid. And finally, the last one here that I'm sure is the least interesting for all of you watching, but Bill Maher, True Story. Okay, so I saw Bill Maher do a stand-up show earlier this year. I had a good time. And I do watch his podcast. And in that podcast, he mentions this book quite a bit. Despite the title, it's a fictional story, but it's based on his experiences being a stand-up comedian in the 80s and 90s. Basically, the story of a fictional stand-up comedian making his way through that industry in the 80s and the 90s. That's actually a pretty interesting topic for a book. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to this. I'm definitely much more interested in reading something like this over one of Bill's polemics. So if I'm going to read a Bill Maher book, it'll be his first, and also not one where he's ranting about how woke college kids are the worst thing ever, or whatever his problems are. So there you go. These are the books I'm planning to read in 2025. If you have read any of them, please let me know. Please share your thoughts in the comments. I would appreciate that. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching this video, and also thank you for a fantastic 2024. If you've tuned in to anything I posted on this channel in the last year, I really appreciate it. 2024 was absolutely my best year in podcasting ever since I started this channel. I'm really proud of all the interviews we've done this year, so if you've watched even a little bit of what's on this channel in 2024, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and as you can see, I've got ideas for this year that I think are going to be good, but I've got even more beyond the books that I've got set aside here, so please stay tuned. I think we're going to have another fantastic year in 2025. And to keep up with us, make sure you subscribe to this channel, find us on social media, and there's going to be a lot of great stuff coming down the pipeline, so stay tuned. But with that, thank you very much for watching this video. Have yourselves a great 2025, and keep rocking.